going to briefly introduce her. She was the founder director of Children's Rights Alliance for England and has since worked as an international consultant and advocate, publishing and lecturing widely on the subject of children's rights. She has been involved in the development of several general comments for the Committee of the Rights of the Child, including on the rights of children to be heard, to play, and recreation, on the rights of children both during adolescence and currently on rights in the digital environment. She was actively involved in the drafting of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as well as working with the Committee of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities on the development of a general comment on inclusive education. She is an adjunct professor at Carleton University, Canada, has an honorary doctorate from the Open University and Carleton University, an honorary fellowship from the University of Central Lancashire, and she's a member of the Open Society Foundation Early Years Advisory Board. And she is also editorial advisory board of the Canadian Journal of Children's Rights. With her, Caro will start the presentation. Carolina, Caro for the friends, has a bachelor in psychology from Universidad de Chile. After graduating, she worked for Sename as a counselor with children who had been sexually abused. Additionally, she has worked as research assistant at Universidad de Chile in a project called Healing Process in Sexual Abuse Narratives from Children and Young People that have been victims, their parents, and psychotherapists. Later on, she did a master in child studies at King's College London, where she researched children's right to be heard in family court protective proceedings in Chile from the perspective of child services professionals. In January, she started her PhD at social science in the Institute of Education at UCL, and her research focuses on kinship care, specifically about experiences of care of children and the grandparents that are bringing them up in Chile. Her research interests are on care, families, childhoods, and narrative research. And as a discussion today, we have Dr. Kiruri Peirce, and she is the program leader for the Master of Sociology of Childhood and Children's Rights at UCL, and her research focuses on memories in childhood and intergenerational relations, art-based approaches with children and youth for peace building, and intersections and dynamics between structural, symbolic, and interpersonal violence in the lives of children and youth. And she's also interested in the impact of policies and programs on children's lives and the relationships between research, policy, and practice. Having said that, the general idea is that we can all discuss and engage in this conversation. And the idea also is that it's not strictly related, or it's not, this conversation cannot be restricted to only people working in academic topics in childhood. The idea is to engage more people in this debate and to realize that we can all have a role in it. So with no further ado, I am pleased to introduce Carolina.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. As Pablo said, I'm Carolina. I'm part of the Perspectives on Southern Childhoods group. And today I want to share with you some ideas that we have discussed in the group about this topic, protection and participation, ways of rethinking childhood in the Chilean context of crisis. So today I'll talk about how it was young people who started the protest that led to the biggest political crisis we've seen in the last 30 years in Chile, and how they now are demanding to be part of the construction of a new society. However, it seems that the importance of including them in this discussion, or any other, is not something that our whole society recognizes. To begin with this seminar, we'd like to share a short video about the context of the Chilean crisis, so we can all understand what are we talking about for our friends that are not Chilean. And later, I'll share some reflections of our group on the role of young people, or the role that young people play in the crisis, and based on that, how childhoods are thought in Chile. Along the presentation, I set out some questions about how, from this crisis, we can rethink children's positions in our society. I'd like to point out that this is a discussion that is just starting, and it needs to be opened up. We need to have a talk about it, and certainly today we have more questions than answers. But I think that the possibility to talk about it here is essential. So thank you to all of you for being here. So first, let's watch the video about the crisis.
Computador está en silencio.
Llamó al propio presidente chileno. Latinoamericano como yo, seguramente has escuchado esto del éxito del modelo económico chileno, el ejemplo a seguir en América Latina, o como le llamó el propio presidente chileno, el oasis en medio de una región con serios problemas económicos. Pero a mediados de octubre llegaron las protestas masivas en Chile. Gente de todas las clases sociales salieron a protestar a las calles. Cacerolazos contra la desigualdad, hartazgo, rechazo a la clase política. Y esto ha puesto al también llamado milagro económico en cuestionamiento y en el centro del debate. Pero, ¿qué es ese famoso modelo económico chileno? ¿Y por qué es tan reconocido como un caso de éxito? Todo partió con la llegada al poder de Augusto Pinochet en 1973, tras derrocar al primer presidente socialista electo en el mundo, Salvador Allende. Allende había instaurado un modelo socialista que incluyó una reforma agraria y la nacionalización de empresas privadas. Pinochet entonces dio marcha atrás al modelo socialista de Allende y comenzó a implementar una fórmula económica diametralmente opuesta. El país se convirtió en una especie de laboratorio del neoliberalismo en la región, algo considerado tan polémico como innovador en su momento. Un grupo de graduados de la Universidad de Chicago, bautizados como los Chicago Boys, tomaron las riendas. Y así fue como comenzó la liberación financiera. Se relajó el control estatal de la economía y se llamó a la inversión extranjera. Y la privatización fue uno de los pilares de ese modelo. Con la creación de la nueva Constitución Política de Chile, servicios básicos como la luz y el agua potable pasaron a manos de privados. También hubo una fuerte privatización en áreas como la salud y la educación. Pero con algunos altibajos, la fórmula económica parecía funcionar, o al menos eso decían las cifras macroeconómicas. El Producto Interno Bruto chileno comenzó a despegar. El ascenso fue casi constante y muy superior a la media de América Latina. En 1990, con el retorno de la democracia, el modelo neoliberal continuó y aunque los gobiernos introdujeron reformas sociales importantes como seguros de salud universal, de desempleo y mejoras en la educación pública, lo cierto es que los pilares del modelo económico de Pinochet siguieron en pie. Aún más, se privatizaron otros servicios públicos como la llamada concesión de las carreteras. Y así, en muchos chilenos comenzó a germinarse la idea de que Chile, más que un país, era una empresa privada. Hoy, el aumento del precio del metro ha destapado lo que pudiéramos llamar una caja de Pandora. Ante la grave crisis que desataron las masivas protestas, el presidente de Chile prometió una serie de medidas para callar a los manifestantes, pero fue demasiado tarde. Muchos chilenos siguen en las calles. ¿Significa esto que fracasó ese modelo que parecía exitoso? Según analistas, había una expectativa entre los chilenos de que la riqueza que mostraban los indicadores macroeconómicos y el gran crecimiento de sus empresas cayera en cascada hacia todos los sectores. Pero eso, de momento, no ha llegado. Y ningún partido o líder político, ni de izquierda ni de derecha, fue capaz de diagnosticar el descontento de la mayoría. Los indicadores macroeconómicos de Chile brillaban y por eso era visto como un modelo económico de éxito. Pero esas cifras escondían lo que estaba ocurriendo debajo. Muchos chilenos dicen sentirse abandonados por el Estado y denuncian abusos del sistema y aseguran que hoy su país es tremendamente desigual. Un modelo donde el Estado interviene poco porque es el mercado el que rige. Y si necesitas un servicio, debes pagar por él. Más de la mitad de la población vive con $600 al mes. Y aunque eso parece no ser tan poco, la verdad es que no alcanza para llegar a fin de mes con los precios de Chile y hay mucho por cubrir. salud pública no es de calidad ni cubre todas las enfermedades. El 20% de la población usa la medicina privada. Si bien la educación superior es gratuita para el 60% de los estudiantes, es muy difícil que llegues a la universidad si antes no pagas por una buena educación privada. Tus ingresos en el futuro dependerán de la educación que te puedas pagar. Por lo tanto, hay poca movilidad social y este es otro efecto de la desigualdad. El sistema de pensiones es otro de los temas que más se ha reclamado en las últimas protestas. Es un fondo privado al que aporta el propio empleado, no los empleadores. Y si eres pensionado en Chile, puedes ser muy pobre. El promedio es de $286 mensuales. Eso es casi la mitad del salario mínimo. Todo esto explica qué hay detrás del estallido social. Lo que vemos ahora son las grietas de un modelo que se ponía como ejemplo de desarrollo de toda la región, pero que debajo escondía un profundo descontento que se fue acumulando por décadas. Bueno, les queríamos dar las gracias por todos los que vieron éxito del modelo económico chileno.
So, as the video said, the current crisis started with a rise in the tube fare, the third one in a year and a half. What the video didn't say is that the secondary school students felt that the rise in the fare was unfair, decided to fight against it. And I'd like to point out something that is key. The student fare did not change that time. So the protest of the students was not an individualistic fight, it was a fight of solidarity. And that students were the protagonists of this demonstration is not something new. In the last 20 years, the students have been key actors in the fight for social rights. Since 2001, we've seen young people actively engaging with political participation and demanding social change. Just to name some of the important protests we've seen, we have the Mochilazo in 2001, the Penguin Revolution in 2006, the feminist protest in 2018, and now we have the protest of October 2019. So about that, this last protest, at the beginning of October, the students started a fare dodging protest that gained strength with time. I will show you just a 1 minute video so you can see how it works. So they were singing something like to evade, not to pay, another way of fight, making this fight their own fight. And what the authorities said about this, when asked about the possibility of reverting the fare rise, the Minister for Transport said that it was a made decision, and she added that she couldn't understand what people were protesting, and I quote, especially in the case of the students that don't have any argument. When saying this, she looked down on the possibility to think by themselves, as if the protests were some kind of tantrum from these young people. The sayings of the ministers and other stakeholders contribute to the presentation of childhood and adolescence in the media as incapable of generating social change. A clear example of this were the sayings of the ex-manager of Metro. In an interview, he said, "It's been 2 or 3 days and it's like 3,500 people. I mean, kiddos, this didn't fire up. You're not gutsier, you haven't won the support of the people." Which is the phrase in Spanish, like, Carlos esto no aprendió. That became, as an anecdote, became a meme and videos and other stuff. So, however, the students had their arguments and they did have the support of the people. As you can see in the photos, it's not very clear, maybe that one, no, those are clear. As you can see in the photos, the fair judging led to a massive protest that extended to the whole country on the 18th of October. The one in the middle is the one that's been called like the biggest march of all times. That only in Santiago convocated more than 1 million people. And I like the one to the left. We can see an elderly man there holding a banner that says, "Thank you, brave youth." So as I was saying, the students had their arguments. For instance, in an interview with the newspaper, Martina from the Students' Union in a school said, "I've heard people several times saying things like, 'You're young, you don't know what you think.' However," she adds, "it's because of us that this revolution started. And a lot of us are people from middle or working class families, and we've lived the reality of these 30 years since the dictatorship. We know about this. It affects our parents, grandparents, the education we get, among other things." So to sum up, on the one hand, we have organized students protesting for what they consider unfair, being able to mobilize and destabilize a whole city. On the other hand, we can see how in the discourse of the authorities, the students are presented as a group incapable of generating social change. So the question here is, where does this contradiction come from? And why do we assume that young people do not have their own ideas and arguments to take part in political action? I would say that part of it has to do with the fact that the more dominant and traditional approaches to childhood and adolescence are based on the idea that development is a staged process leading to adulthood. Here, I'm going to take some things that Jason and others have argued, that we assume that adulthood is a normative status and an ideal state. From this perspective, children and young people lack some characteristics that adults possess, such as cognitive capacities, autonomy, independence, and so on. This means that the understanding of childhood is centered in a negative definition of the children, as those who don't know or who cannot do yet. And although we have seen on the streets many teenagers, they still fall in this description, as they are not fully children nor fully adults. They are in what have been called the liminal zone, space that is not very clear. When they are seen with these characteristics, children's opinions are not relevant and there is no space for them to express them. In this view, they have to be protected from what is considered adults-only territory, as political actors. Therefore, this crisis has started with young people protests and is the background that might allow us to rethink how we position children in our society. In this regard, the developmental theories of childhood as a preparatory phase to adulthood, or the reading of children as passive and dependent subjects who socialize to read childhood as a golden standard, might be reinterpreted. The social protest in Chile has shown how the collective action of young people goes beyond the individual interest of each of them. They act based on a transversal and shared aims. The beginning of the protest might be understood as a Hegelian value rational action. The young people protested as a way of achieving their ends, which were determined by values of solidarity and justice. We think that these actions invite us to rethink the position of young people in their everyday life. Youth became agents that mobilize values in a political field, acting in the public sphere of life. Thus, so far, we have seen some tensions. For example, in the way that children and childhood are depicted in relational terms to adulthood and adults. The children's differences are seen as deficit and in negative terms, for which they have to be protected and kept in the private spheres of life. But at the same time, in this crisis, they are slowly gaining recognition from their engagement and in social life. These tensions have also permeated the formation of the institutional initiative for childhood. In the particular case of Chile, despite the broad network that provides services to children and young people, the iconic institution that is held responsible for children's conditions is CENAME. When CENAME was created in 1979, it was built based on the tutelary model, which sees children as minors. Indeed, the name is Service for National Service for Minors. That's the CENAME. These tutelary narratives depict children as objects of protection, as incomplete and incapable beings that need a special approach, providing restricted possibilities for their recognition as social actors. Since its origins, CENAME has been under a constant reformation, being the most important ones the slow incorporation of the children's rights framework, the reinforcement of the privatizations of services to an extended network of collaborators, and the incorporation of narratives of human capital on notions about children and childhood. These reforms can be considered as an addition to CENAME's previous features, but they're not a total transformation, causing that nowadays the service is crossed with contradictions and hybrids between those different frameworks. And why do I talk about CENAME? Because it has been one of the most criticized public institutions these days. Because it's supposed to be a protection system, but it has not been able to neither grant children's rights nor their participation. Indeed, this photo here is a photo of an urban intervention from a few days ago. As you can see, there is a big banner there saying Hielis in CENAME. And down there, there's another one saying that CENAME collapsed before MED. And these are not the only one. There are lots of banners in the protest talking about how CENAME is in crisis and it's named as Hell for Children in the protesters' words. And here I just want to highlight some ideas because to talk in depth about CENAME probably we would need a whole conference. But first, as the banner says, CENAME is an institution that has been harshly questioned in the recent years, especially since the death of Lisette, an 11-year-old that died while living in a CENAME's house in 2016. This is an institution that creates and reproduces inequalities and violence. It is an institution that claims to protect, and quotation marks, vulnerable children, when it is of public knowledge that within the CENAME's homes and other residences, children's rights are constantly violated. In the last years, there has been a demand for justice for all those children that have died and have been abused under CENAME's care. However, these demands have not been heard. And I would like to just stop for a second on the idea that CENAME is protecting children. To say that protection is a tricky activity. According to Toronto, protection is the defense against extraordinary incursions of violence or other forms of disruption into our daily life. And that might be seen as care. However, and in her words, I quote, protection involves a very different conception of the relationship between an individual or a group and others that does care. Caring seems to involve taking the concerns and needs of the other as the basis for action. Protection presumes the bad intentions and harm that the other is likely to bring to bear against the self or group and to require a response to that potential harm. So I would dare to say that what we need is to move from a logic of an institution that protects children to one that cares about and for them, taking the children's needs as the starting point for what must be done. And this point is crucial for our discussion because it means that you need to listen to the children and young people to be able to take care of them. So participation, this is listening to children and taking their opinions into account, would not be the opposite of protection, as might be thought. It would be its foundation. And I guess the open question here is, how do we create learning institutions that grant children their rights? And how do we achieve that this logic of participation and care reach children's everyday life? One may argue that it is relevant a cultural change in the understanding of childhood. But also, one could say, as I argued before, that it is important to think that children and young people should be able to take part in the public spheres of life. It is key that they enter in the political activism arena and have a say and a real impact on issues affecting them. This crisis has offered the possibility to think ways of doing this. So how do we achieve this? And how do we incorporate children and young people into our democracy and into the decision making? In the last few weeks, it has been discussed for the first time in the country if young people from 16 years of age should be allowed to vote in the referendum for a new constitution. The students have said that they want to be included in the process, but it has been a controversial issue. The arguments against it are the same that I already mentioned before: that they are immature, that they don't know that they don't have their own opinions, they are easily influenced, and very importantly, they have to be protected from being politically used or contaminated. There is again this dominant narrative about childhood as a moment in life of lack of. And although we think it is progress that they are allowed to vote, we think this is a very restrictive way of understanding children's participation, or citizen participation in general. First, because it would allow to take part in the process only to those young people over 16. So what about all the other children and young people? We could say that we know that children and young people under 18 represent a quarter of the population in the country. So it is legitimate to build a country without them. If we have seen that they are able to raise important issues in the political agenda, it is acceptable to leave them out. And given the institutional crisis, how would this participation reach children under Sename's care? Second, with this proposal, the politicians are thinking participation as the right to vote. And we understand that participation goes far beyond that. We think it is important to create spaces that allow children participation, not only at an institutional level, but also in other everyday spaces, and that promote intergenerational conversations. And why it is important? Because expressing their ideas and being listened to validates them as subjects, because deliberation allows them to learn about democracy and collaboration, because participation helps to build community, and because participation is related to protection and to care. So I just would like to give you with some takeaway points that are more questions than points, maybe, to later open up the discussion. First, that children and young people are relevant political actors. They proved it. However, they are not being recognized as such. Second, that institutional and public policies affecting children are supposedly built based on a rights perspective. However, they seem not to be considering children's participation. It is possible to really have a rights approach without participation. And knowing that institutions do not exist in a vacuum, how can this crisis contribute to the transformation of the Chilean institutions in relation to children? What is this crisis questioning from these institutions? Is this crisis only questioning how we think institutions, or it is also questioning our frameworks on childhood? And finally, the crisis is forcing us to rethink children's everyday lives and the institutions around them. So the question, I guess, is if the changes don't come now, then when? Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. So there's a lot of resonance between what you're going to say. So what I thought I would do is really, sort of drawing on that, really look at what is the human rights context and what's the background really in terms of what rights children have and how they've transitioned over the last 30 years. So what we have was a radical vision by the drafters of the Convention on Rights of the Child. 30 years ago, we've been celebrating the 30th anniversary over the last couple of months since the Convention was adopted by the UN General Assembly. And what it did was transform, despite what's actually happening on the ground, on paper, what the Convention did was transform, the status of children and how children are perceived. So it began to see, instead of children simply as objects of protection, it began to recognise children as active agents. It began to recognise you needed to acknowledge the transition from babyhood through to 18, through a process of their evolving capacities and their increasing capacity to exercise their own rights on their own behalf, and that they were subjects of rights, not recipients of adult protection. So transform the status of children. So the scope of the CSC, which you're probably very familiar with, it's a comprehensive human rights treaty. So it deals with socio-economic rights, it deals with protection rights, and it deals with participation rights. And there's a whole package of rights that are encompassed in the language of participation, which has very, very different meanings depending on where you're sitting, your age, your approach, attitudes to children, but also what language you speak in. Because many languages, we use this in English, but it's a concept which doesn't translate very easily into Russian, Spanish, I don't think into Chinese, into Arabic. It's a very difficult word to comprehend. So what do we actually mean by participation? So it starts with Article 12. So Article 12, which talks about the right of every child capable of forming a view, the right to express that view and have it taken seriously. The Committee on Rights of the Child, the international monitoring body, has recognised this as a right for children as individuals, so for example in the court or in the healthcare, but children as a collective, children, as you've seen in Chile, children being heard as a group, whether it's in policies, in legal reforms, in local schools or whatever. Then it applies to all matters of concern to them. So the committee have defined this very widely. It's all matters that concern children are relevant for Article 12, and it must apply in all judicial proceedings. And children need to be able to express their views freely, and it's not enough just to listen, you have to take what they say seriously. So the implications are, this is unique, there's nothing comparable with this in any other human rights treaty. And it's imperative, for me, I think this is really fundamental as an element of human dignity. For any of us, whatever age we are, it's important that we listen to, that people take it seriously when they're making decisions about us, that we should be part of that decision. It's fundamental to human dignity. It's important also to recognise the CRC doesn't give children autonomy. It doesn't transfer all decision making to children, but it does recognise that when those decisions are being made, children should be a part of those processes. And it creates a clear obligation on states, on governments, on local authorities, municipalities, teachers, doctors, to create a space for children to speak out, to have the opportunity, to have the information they need to do that, and that those views are given consideration. In that sense, it's both a procedural and a substantive right. So it's procedure in the sense that participation is fundamental to the realisation of other rights, but it's substantive in its own right and on its own behalf. But that's not the full story. So we also need to look at the other package of civil and political rights that we mentioned. So freedom of expression, and this is really important in the context of what's going on in Chile. So any child is entitled to have their views and express those views on anything that's of concern to them. The only restrictions are those needed to protect the rights of others or the rights of security. So, for example, you might have that somebody who is expressing homophobic views, for example, that would be in the law provided they didn't interfere with the actual rights of others, so that they weren't oppressing somebody who was gay, they weren't causing violence to them or causing other people to trigger or to encourage violence or incite violence towards them. So you can express views even if other people really take offence at them, provided it's not actually violating the rights of those individuals. So it's a complex balance. And the onus, in relation to Article 13 on the state, is to create an environment where children and adults can express their views freely without oppression. But there's no obligation inherent in Article 13 to take any notice of what they're saying. Article 14, freedom of thought, conscience and religion. So children are entitled to their own values, their own beliefs, their own religion. There is some provision in Article 14 that it must be, there must be recognition of parental rights to provide guidance in accordance with the child's evolving capacities. So the states have to respect your right and not persecute you because of your religion, but also prohibit discrimination and promote tolerance. And it's not permitted to have state indoctrination to force children to take on a particular belief through the education system. And the committee have been very clear, it's the child who exercises the right to freedom of religion, not the parent. And then you've got Article 15, again, which is really critical for the context in Chile. So freedom of association, the right to meet up in sports clubs and youth groups, in childhood groups, political parties, informal, formal, online, offline. So children have a right to meet and be with who they want to be with. And they also have a right to organise political activities, protest marches, demonstrations, press conferences, and so on. They have a right to take part in those activities. Again, the only restrictions are for the safety of others and protection of the rule of law. So the concept of participation needs to be understood as encompassing all of those rights, including Article 5, which is this provision which talks about the gradual transfer of decision making and the exercise of rights from the parent to the child as the child acquires capacity. And all of that needs to be underpinned by children's right to information. You need information to make decisions and to be involved, protection of their best interests, privacy, and non-discrimination. There are huge differences in the opportunities of different groups of children to articulate their views. In some parts of the world, for example, girls are extremely isolated from the public environment and much less able to express their views. So why does it matter? I mean, you've touched on this, but basically, as I say, it's a fundamental right, it's central to human dignity. It's really important in terms of addressing violence and abuse. If children are silenced, if they have no means of redress, no avenues to speak out, there's a culture of not listening to, not believing, not thinking what children say is of value or importance, it becomes very much more easy to violate them, to abuse them, to sexually assault them, and they have no means of redress. If you look at the institutions across the world over the last 30 years that we've seen exposed, the BBC here, we've seen the Catholic Church, we've seen care institutions of children, where children have been abused systematically over years and years and years. It's never come to public view because children have had no safe avenue for redress and for speaking out, and there's a culture of silence in children. So it's really important in terms of addressing abuse. Capacity development, children talk constantly about, that when they're given an opportunity to speak out, how much more they gain in confidence and competence. You get better decisions if you're taking account of what children are saying and their lived experience. You're going to get better decision making at the policy level. It helps children understand the whole process of democratic engagement, about reciprocity, about coming together, about coping with negotiation and so on. Those skills are part and parcel of participation and really important for learning about how to engage in a democratic environment. And fundamentally, strengthen accountability. It's about only if you've got a voice can you hold decision makers, policy makers, politicians, governments to account. You can't do that without a voice, which is why they so often want to silence you. So it's about empowerment. So you start, if you like, with, which is a model taken from the women's movement, but that you start with empowerment within the children who feel that they're listened to and taken seriously, have a sense of more self-efficacy, more self-confidence, a greater sense of dignity and self-worth. And that leads to empowerment with, so beginning to look at your peer group, looking at collaboration, looking at solidarity, looking at common experiences and shared oppression. You get strength from that. And together then you can empower too. You can begin to change, you can begin to act, you can begin to create some political influence and move to change. So there's a whole process of empowerment. So in order for children to be able to be heard and to be recognised properly, there's a whole set of things that need to happen really. I mean, what you need in a society where children are valued is recognition that they have capacity, that they are competent, that they have significant views which are worth listening to, that they're entitled to be heard. It's not just a privilege, that it's legitimate, that it makes sense that there is a legitimate value in children being part of a political debate, but also recognising that children aspire to, if you talk to children, want more than anything, to be respected and to be listened to. And in order to make that happen, you need a conducive legislative and policy environment. The political context will influence that, whether it's an authoritarian or democratic state. The social norms, the attitudes to children, the sense that you were talking about children not being seen as competent actors, not having a valuable contribution to make. Socioeconomic context, but also the amount of information and awareness. Children don't know they have rights because it's very difficult for them to argue for them and claim them. If teachers, parents, social workers, politicians don't know that children have rights, they're going to be much less willing to engage in measures necessary. So 30 years ago, so we had the CRC with all of that meaning, and what we've seen is hundreds of thousands actually of initiatives across all sectors. We've seen children being involved in child protection, education, health, reproductive health. We've seen a huge number of different methodologies and approaches, children involved in peer education, research, advocacy, community development, campaigning, human rights defending. There are loads of child-led organisations, children's parliaments in your region. There are a number of very, very effective and powerful working children's movements. And the children are beginning to be more present on national and international platforms. So we can see this is not new. This has been happening for a very long time. So we had in the 60s and 70s, when I was beginning my political awareness, the anti-apartheid demonstrations, the South African school protests against being forced to learn Afrikaans in school, the civil rights movements, the Vietnam War demonstrations. You know, there was a lot going on a long time ago. But we've begun to see, I think, this year, a real escalation in how young people are beginning to be mobilised. I mean, we've seen, obviously, Greta Thunberg and the climate change strikes and campaigning. Very effective lobby by the school students in Florida, who from the school where there was so many children killed. Palestinians challenging Israeli oppression, children in many countries challenging poverty, inequality, oppression, lack of freedoms, corruption, and you've got child human rights defenders challenging rights violations. So there's a lot happening globally at the moment. And I think, the context is obviously complex, and this is just some initial sort of thoughts, that some of the factors that I think are contributing to this at the moment are, we are seeing growing authoritarianism. We are seeing, you think about the number of states around the world now, you've got Russia, you've got China, you've got Turkey, you've got Brazil, you've got the Philippines, you've got Chile, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland in Europe. You've got Turkey, you've got Donald Trump. And so you've got these countries which are moving towards a much greater degree of authoritarianism and away from democracy. There is a frightening, I think, backlash against democracy and democratic values, the rule of law, respect for human rights. There's a real pushback, for example, very specifically against some of the gains that have been made in relation to children's rights. And one of the things the Convention did was bring children out from within the family and recognise that they got to assume their rights within the family entity, that they have rights as an individual within the family as they do elsewhere. And that's been recognised in law in most countries in the world now through child protection legislation. And the right to be heard. But what we're seeing now is many states wanting to roll back that legislation and re-embrace the child within and defined by the family, and the family defined in very conventional terms. So, within marriage, within a heterosexual couple, and all other families being denied legitimacy. We're seeing more repression of civil rights and freedoms. Some of the international civil rights organisations are saying that there's less space for civil society in countries around the world every year, that they're closing down civic space by authoritarian repressive governments. We're also seeing massive inequalities, growing inequalities, huge corporate wealth, huge small number of excessively wealthy people, while many people around the world are suffering. We've got a huge number of conflicts. There are more children living exposed to war and living in situations of transition, migration, refugee camps, internally displaced, asylum seekers and refugees, huge numbers of children, and more awareness of the damage that that's doing, the disruption, the potential for recruitment to radicalisation and so on. And finally, the complete failure of the powers that be to take sufficiently seriously the climate emergency. So there's a whole set of contributing factors, and I think there are a number of things that have enabled youth movements and youth activism to take hold as well. Clearly the growth of the internet, and we've seen, so what that does for many children who live in war, in the global south in particular, but it enables them to see alternatives because they can engage with them and they're not contained entirely within their own cultures, within their own values and norms and traditions. They're able to see alternatives, they're able to see that there are other ways of thinking, other ways of living, other opportunities. It raises aspirations, it transforms aspirations. It enables them to mobilise and to network in a way that was unimaginable without the internet. It gives you access to information and data for campaigning purposes. And also more and more children around the world are being educated, and with that knowledge and information, they're better armed in terms of challenging human rights violations. And I think the scale of the risks is beginning to force people to begin to think we can't sit by and let this happen. So there's been a lot of discussion about child human rights defenders and the role that they're playing. And human rights defenders, anyone who individually or in association with others strives for protection of human rights. And so it's anyone, and so the definition applies to anyone of any age, so it equally extends to children. And I think it's increasingly recognised that children and young people play a really critical role. They have a powerful voice of change, and it's extraordinary the impact that Greta Thunberg has had globally. I mean, one 16-year-old, 14-year-old, 15-year-old sitting outside her school with a placard every Friday afternoon on her own has achieved now sort of global recognition. I mean, apparently she's in Madrid at the climate change conference at the moment, and she's mobbed everywhere she goes. I mean, everybody wants a piece of her. You know, she has become a kind of global heroine. That may or may not be a good thing, but the fact is that she, as a 16-year-old, has achieved that degree of public recognition and that degree of support. And the thing is that young people bring a unique dimension to the table because they have a unique experience of their own human rights violations, which cannot be understood unless we listen to them. Because our experiences as adults are different, and we look at it with a different lens and from a different perspective. Child Rights Connect, which is a Geneva-based NGO, international NGO with membership all over the world, they've done some research on this recently, and they found that when there is growth of human rights defenders for children all over the world, and the kind of things that they're really exercised by and concerned is freedom of expression, denial of the right to freedom of expression, rape, child marriage, and other forms of gender-based violence, the voting age and the desire to be given the formal rights to vote, and all forms of discrimination and exclusion. And the challenges they face are the ones that you described, really, that children have low status, they're not recognised as having value, they have what to say, they're excluded from decision-making forums, they're discriminated against as children in most communities, in many countries of the world. But they're equally at risk of bullying, of imprisonment, of torture, violence. I was a few years ago, I was in Cairo in Egypt, and I met with a group of young people who wanted to they wanted to try and set up a children's rights commissioner for Egypt. And I met with these young people, and they were all activists, and many of them have been imprisoned and tortured in prison because they've been on the streets fighting their concerns about the repression within the government at the time. And of course, even where legal rights do exist, they're not necessarily implemented or respected. So we have to balance, because they're children and they're entitled to additional protections, we have to balance their right to be safe and to be protected, but also not at the expense of their right to be heard. So the kind of actions needed, and these are obligations on governments, given the commitments they've made under the CRC, that there needs to be legislation with no age restrictions, which guarantees appropriate and relevant protection for children exercising the right to peaceful assembly. There should be no discriminations in those exercises. So, for example, in the UK, we have some authorities have curfews, so children can't go out at certain times. So it's a blanket ban on all children so that they can't organise, they can't with their peer group. And protections from undue restrictions on freedom of assembly. There need to be safe and accessible mechanisms of complaint and redress. There needs to be training for professionals on what those rights are and how they should transform both their practice and their institutions to respect those rights. Teachers, police, judges, parents, and other professionals. And support for the formulation of children's own organisations and the right of children. In many countries, it's not legally possible for children to register their own organisations and not to be able to raise funds. And then finally, because the activism that children are showing is in response to rights violations, and governments do have obligations to deal with the kind of fundamental challenges that children are raising. So issues like adequate standard of living for children's development, basic demands, the right to quality education, the right to access healthcare, the right to access justice, and the right to be free from all forms of discrimination. So those are the obligations on governments. So we've come a long way in 30 years. We've begun to talk about this. We have a language for talking about this. We have a concept of it, and we've seen many children really moving forward in demanding that this right is respected. It is fundamental. We have to be prepared to challenge the power bases of adult institutions and advocate for real and sustained rights. We also need to recognise children are not adults. They need additional support, protection and care in order that they can engage in these activities without undue harm. And we need to move beyond participation being privilege for the few towards being an entitlement for everybody. And that involves, in most societies in the world, in the UK and in Chile, profound cultural transformation in our attitudes to children. Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking me to be a discussant at this important event. I'm not going to talk for too long because I want to open the floor up to questions. But I guess there was 3 points I wanted to pick up on. The first kind of cross-cutting both presentations, I think, was both the possibilities but also the problems sometimes with concepts of children's rights, particularly the ways in which the language of children's rights is sometimes used either in a more tokenistic way or the language of rights is used, but then we don't see a translation into practice. And this is probably slightly more a question for Jerison, but was whether some of the challenges we see are kind of coming from some of the language that we use when we talk about children's rights. So we talk about rights to protection and rights to participation. When we talk about adults' rights, for example, we talk about political and civil rights, we talk about economic, social, cultural rights. And so the fact that we have a different way of talking about rights in relation to children, I'm wondering if that might feed into some of the challenges that we see. Building on that point, also in relation to the right to participation. So again, as you've written about extensively, the right to participation often gets used in a very tokenistic way. And I'm wondering about the kind of the newer movements that you talked about in relation to talking about children's human rights defenders or children as activists. I'm wondering if that kind of re-injects some of that kind of more radical potential in relation to thinking about children and participation that's perhaps become a bit diluted. And the question to Carolina was how much the language of rights was being used by the young people in their activism. And I was thinking about the kind of the disconnect you were talking about between the more kind of what's in the laws and the policies and kind of what's not happening in practice. And Carl Hansen and Olga Neuenhaus talk about rights from living rights or rights from below. And that's the idea of thinking about how do children and young people kind of make meaning of rights in their everyday lives and kind of reclaim that language of rights. So I was thinking in relation to Chile, whether we're seeing some kind of more exciting potential there in the way that children and young people might be using the language of rights, if indeed they are. The second point, we're thinking about intergenerational relationships and solidarity. Carolina raised the point about how can we kind of create spaces for dialogue. And I was wondering how much that's the kind of creation of additional spaces for dialogue. Often sometimes they become kind of co-opted or rather performative, tokenistic, or how much kind of dialogue is taking place anyway, kind of within the protest, if you've got younger generations or older generations together, ways in which that kind of might be sustained going forward. The third point, I think both of you talked about kind of understandings of childhood and the kind of needs for shifts in understanding. And I think obviously it's very pertinent with the example that Carolina gave from Chile, but I also think this is a kind of a global question. The votes for 16 is a debate kind of here in the UK as well. But what I think also is interesting is kind of how the representations of children change. So we were talking, Jerison was talking about Greta Thunberg, but then on the other hand, you've got the case of Shamima Begum, a 15-year-old girl who joined a man who was fighting for ISIS I think had a relationship and then was wanting to come back to the UK, and the kind of the response from particularly the right-wing media was she knew what she was doing, she was old enough to know, and so kind of you have this discrepancy between Greta Thunberg being presented as kind of being manipulated and not knowing what she's talking about, and then on the other hand, another young woman, Shamima Begum, being kind of, well, she knew what she was getting into. So I guess I think sort of highlighting some of these tensions in representations of young people and how we kind of make those more explicit. And then the last point I wanted to pick up, I thought was an excellent question that Pavel mentioned at the start of the seminar, but what's the role of the scholar? And I'd be interested to hear people's reflections. Many of us either work in academia or are involved with research in different capacities. So what is our role? Kind of what role can we play in kind of solidarity with the young people in Chile and young activists around the world? What role can our scholarship play in trying to affect?
Do you want to know? Shall I respond?
Maybe you two respond and then you
okay. I mean, it's very interesting to say about the language because it's been there's been a lot of discussion about that at these various conferences I've been at over the last month or so. With a lot of people saying we should move away from the language of children's rights and talk about the human rights of children. And so we talk about the human rights of women or the human rights of people with disabilities, but the human rights of children. Because what we've tended to do is see children's rights as all warm and furry over here, and human rights are sort of, tough challenges that we have to really fight to achieve. And I think it's a false dichotomy and unhelpful, I think, in many ways. But there is a challenge because, so if you look at other human rights treaties that relate to a particular group, so CEDAW on women, the CRPD on people with disabilities, CERN on racial discrimination, those treaties are fundamentally about non-discrimination. They're about saying that those groups of people are entitled to the realization of their rights on an equal basis with others. They're basically non-discrimination treaties. The CRC is not a non-discrimination. Obviously, it deals with discrimination, but it's not saying children need to be treated on the same basis as adults, because it recognizes that there are many areas where you need additional rights because your children, so there's concept of best interest, the rights to protection from violence, the protections in relation to child labour, the compulsory nature of schooling, but equally you don't have the right to marry and found family because the minimum age of marriage is recommended as 18. You don't have the right to vote. You don't have the right to work full time at any age. So there are many differences. So we do have, so children's rights are different in that sense. The many rights are the same. The ones on civil liberties are broadly the same. And the rights to, an adequate standard of living. But in the CRC, it talks about children's proper development. The right to an adequate standard of living in the international covenant is not qualified by development context. So it's seeing So there are many differences, and so we have to find a way of recognizing that the children do not have autonomy. There isn't a presumption that children have capacity from whatever age to take responsibility for themselves. They're entitled to protection. So it's about finding a language which both acknowledges those differences but doesn't undermine the status of children and diminish the importance and significance of those rights in the way of doing it. So maybe we need to talk about the rights of children rather than children's rights. Sorry, that was long.
About the people using the language of rights, well, it's a bit difficult for me to judge this moment because I'm here. but I guess that when I read the quote that I read here about this young girl saying, that she says that all this she called this revolution started because of young people, and they want to be included. And I guess that with time since the CRC, the language of rights has been incorporated in the discourse. I would say that children are aware that they have the rights, that they can talk, but also they are very aware that they are not taken very seriously. And when you were talking about intergenerational dialogues, I was thinking that there's been I don't know how to translate this, but assemblies of people in Chile everywhere, people meeting to discuss what do we want to do from this crisis with the country. And there has been some meetings of children and young people to talk about what do we want for the country now. And I've read some conclusions from those meetings, and it's interesting how this recognition of we have something to contribute is there, but at the same time this idea that there are not being listened to is also very clear. And I guess that those spaces where children and young people can talk with their peers and but also with adults about what do they want for Chile are kind of in this situation, and maybe are opening the possibility for them to feel that they are being listened. But yes, I don't know if someone else has a different view because it's.
I would like to ask: do they need to use the children's rights language, or is it something a tool that institutions have to learn to deal with problems affecting children and young people? Maybe it's a language that is not specifically. It wasn't raised or it wasn't brought from children, and maybe it's something that is a tool that is very interesting to use for institutions to translate those issues for granted by children and young people.
So I just was thinking about maybe not using children's rights language, about maybe like how they take this idea that they have. That they can say
but I would really argue strongly for the use of language of rights, because with rights come obligations and entitlement. And if you take away the language of rights, you're removing, if you like, the legitimate demands that you're making on governments that they have committed to under international law. And so I think it's about accountability. So empowerment is very important because those are the processes by which young people are able to be mobilized, but they are demanding something to which they are entitled.
I was thinking also about the gap that there is between what is happening and what the government is supposed to be accountable for. And how do we that
Yes,
dance
yes, well,
to get to
get to that, yeah.
Thank you both so much for really stimulating talk. For me, the last question, curiosity is constantly playing over my mind. The question of what role can we take as academics of childhood to be. I think we are very good at childhood and solidarity, but for me, a great source of frustration comes when I speak to people about, don't take it for granted like us that children do have rights and agency and can participate in their social lives in meaningful ways. And for me, has been so far the biggest gap to confront. And I would just be really interested to hear what everyone thinks about this, because time and time again, I just find myself having to convince, like I have to start from zero, having to convince people to start with that children need to be listened to and they have meaningful contributions to make. So.
I was I was thinking a little bit like a mix between like interrelational dialogues and our participation as scholars, because in Chile now the Ministry of Education, Marcela Cubillos, she said that she's going to prosecute because she wants to investigate schools and teachers that were using children for political activity and for indoctrination. So how can we rethink that indoctrination? Can we rethink it as an interrelational dialogue? But there's a power position there as well in the school. So how can we rethink that and how that in our power relationship that we assume when we do research with children, can we create that interrelational dialogue as well? Oh, yeah.
I was thinking about that, sorry, when we were talking to, because of this law, that we wanted to say something about it, but it was too soon. Yes, I was thinking also how, because when you think about giving young people the right to vote, I think it's not enough with giving them the right to vote. You have to create spaces to talk, to discuss, to deliberate, etc. And I was thinking about the schools, like how do we create democratic spaces in schools? What is the role that the schools play in this? Because finally kids spend in there, and with this kind of laws, it's very difficult to think the schools as political places and the teacher as a political actor.
There's some interesting, I think schools are really, it's a fraught, difficult issue because, as you say, it's basically it's such a strong power relationship between the teachers and the children. But there are, I don't know if any of you are familiar with in the UK with the UNICEF Rights Respecting Schools model. So basically what they do is schools volunteer to become a rights respecting school. And they put together a small team, a group of children and teachers to work towards developing an action plan, what they're going to do. They have a bit of training from UNICEF, and then they introduce an action plan of how they're going to move the agenda forward. So the idea is that learning about rights isn't just about on a Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock you have an hour on Article 1 says, Article 2 says. It's about living those rights and experiencing them and creating environments in which those rights are respected for everybody within the school. And this model has been enormously successful. So they piloted it. And then they got, I think it was Sussex University, to do an independent evaluation. And what they found was that there was less bullying, there was less graffiti, there was less truanting, teachers had more job satisfaction, relationships between children and teachers improved. And I went to visit one of their schools in West London, a very poor housing estate. And I met the head teacher, and she said, before we did this, my day would be spent with a group of kids lined up outside my door, thrown out of class by the teacher because they were swearing, fighting, refusing to turn their phone off, whatever. And now I get maybe one child a month. You know, my life has been transformed by this because we enlist children as part of the solution instead of constructing the children as the problems to address. And so it's completely transforming the nature of the relationships. And so it involves the classroom, it involves the way you develop school rules and the way you allocate the budget and the way you recruit new staff. The whole school is infused with the rights respecting. And there are now, UNICEF became a problem because so many schools wanted to do this that they couldn't keep up with the demand. And then the government put in quite a lot of money because they could see it was developing. So there are ways, but it takes, you know, it's a lot of work and a lot of commitment, but that has proved it's a win-win. So I think there are models you need to adapt for a different cultural context.
Pursuing that topic, you know how teachers were able to maybe change from a vertical perspective to really take the mind of the children. I believe that's very important in childhood and in the whole society because I believe that there is a demand for more participation and it's not being solved by politicians, maybe because they don't want or because they are not able to do so how have they solved that teachers?
Well, I think they've solved it. In the case of this particular model, they've solved it because there's a payoff for teachers. So you've got to persuade teachers there's something in it for them, because otherwise they're giving up power, you know, for no benefit. But in this case, you know, they're getting better results. You know, they're getting less confrontation and conflict, better relationships. So there's a big payoff for the teachers. I think the other thing, which sounds kind of tangential, but I think is really relevant, is the implication of us moving into a digital world. Because I think that changes the whole nature of education. That what we need to be thinking about is not the sort of model we have here, which is largely rooted in Victoriana, you know, the 19th century model of the teacher knows all, delivers it all to the children, and they have to listen and absorb. You know, with the internet, most of us, you can find out most things online. We've got this extraordinary library out there that any school can have access to. I mean, there's issues about language and there's issues about whether schools have got proper Wi-Fi and so on, but by and large. So that changes the way you need to learn. So instead of the teacher becoming the kind of all-knowing, so what children are demanding, we've just done two huge global consultations with children. One, because we're developing this general comment on the digital environment. So we consulted with 600 children in 23 countries. And another piece of work, what we're trying to look at indicators and accountability, we consulted with 2,000 children in 40 countries. And some of the things that have come up there too are around the digital. And what children are saying is what we need is not schools which teach us facts. We need schools that teach us how to analyse, where to go, how to discern, how to discriminate between information, how to understand fake news, how to utilise that. And so children want to work more collaboratively, they want to work in teams, they want to be doing their own research, and the role of the teacher becomes the facilitator rather than the font of all knowledge. And I think that changes, you know, that lends itself to a potentially different kind of relationship between children and parents as well. So I think you need the kind of rights-based framework and the commitment to change, but also utilise the kind of technological changes which are influencing
And my English is the worst of the world.
Sorry, I'm not speaking very
No,
fast.
no. I understand all, but my English for talk is bad. And I was thinking about the first question too, about the role of the academia. And I don't know really well how is it in UK because I just arrived here. But I think in Chile, for me, it's very important to build more bridge between the academia and the state, academia and the childhood or adolescent or whatever be the subject of our research. Because I think the academia in Chile, I talk more to America, it's like it's function like a bubble, and it's so bad because it's like we see the right. It's like we see all things what happen in the society. We write about them, and exactly. And I think it's not enough to include the children in our research only like a participator. It's important to have an active role in society. And I think in South America is the activists and the academia is not very close area, and maybe in this point for this crisis, I think the academia or the intellectuals have a lot of responsibility.
I completely agree, and I think there's a huge role for scholars because, in terms of collaboration, not just with government, but with the NGO community who are working with children and supporting children as well, that those organisations need evidence. It's really important to be, to collaborate with academics on where the research is needed, what research is needed, and to begin to find ways of utilising that evidence in order to strengthen rights-based evidence. It's so that you're not just researching away in your separate ivory tower, but actually collaborating with the people who can influence policy on the ground.
And for grad papers, because the papers is not written by the people.
Yeah.
We have to think about another way to
Make it accessible.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Really important. And NGOs are often crying out for evidence, because the donors want, well, what works, what's effective. The governments want to know, why should I do this? Where's the evidence? So, for example, on example here at the moment on access to justice, criminal justice, youth offending. So we have a government which is completely indifferent to the evidence, is populist, just responding with the gut to what's going to get them more votes. And we need to find ways of making the evidence compelling, available, accessible, so that people can, so that we can use that to make the case that locking up more and more and more people for longer and longer times in more and more punitive environments actually doesn't produce safer societies. And how do we use the evidence to make that point?
Thank you. And many apologies that I was so late, but I was really intrigued with the right to respect in schools that we keep using. And one of the reasons is that while I think those are great ideas, and the second idea is a great idea, that and the way you describe it, but what I think frequently happens is that the children fit to the school's agenda. So they buy into an agenda. And one has to ask, is that really respecting children's rights, or is it a Foucauldian way of reducing? Well, it's self-disciplinary processes, basically. And that if we would want real change, it can't be just expecting the status quo to be maintained, whether it is with testing regimes or within a particular school. So I just wondered if you could say something about that, because it's all. I mean, if I were a head teacher, I would love not to have confused with children. But actually, if you want real change, then you might not have confused with children, but it might not be so easy for the head teacher either.
Yeah, I think what that model does is operate within an existing overarching power relationship. So it doesn't transform those power relationships. What it does is it gives you an opportunity to acquire very different skills from the ones that they normally have. It enables them to have a notion of a just claim and a legitimate claim, which most children don't have, in terms of what they can expect from the schools. But the power still remains with the head teacher and the governing body and the teachers in the classroom. So there isn't what it doesn't do is transform the fundamentals of the power relationship. What it does is give children more power within those.
For some children.
Yeah, no, not all children. And it's by far from perfect. And I think the way in which we conceptualize education for generations, decades, it has been is highly problematic. I think it's a complex issue that children have a right to be forced to go to school. That in itself is a curious concept, isn't it? You have a right to full-time education, but you're going to be compelled to exercise that. Those other rights, you have some choice. Your parents on your behalf. So I think there's a huge debate about what that right looks like, what it means, whether it's capable of being fundamentally transformed. I think what I'm talking about is a reformist, not a revolutionary approach to trying to make the education system more acceptable for children. But I don't have any answers. How do you change that, given that children do not have autonomy and they're not presumed to have capacity to exercise decision making automatically as children? And how do you reconcile that with the fundamental shift between children and adults? It's a complex and answers is ultimately how you remove the hierarchy of those relationships from children, from the existing status quo.
I mean, I agree, and I think the danger is that I've seen critiques of the rights respect in school, and just coming back to the Chile example as well. When I was reading some information and I saw that the kind of president had introduced a new policy called Safe Schools, I think it translates. Yeah. And so that language of safe schools for someone kind of coming from a child rights background was quite shocking, given that it entailed kind of police going into schools and so on. So I think that the language and the concept of rights often do kind of get co-opted and kind of become a way of dressing up the status quo. I guess the question is then, is it possible, whether it's the young people in Chile or in other contexts, to kind of reclaim ideas of rights? Is it possible to use that as a way of kind of rethinking power relations or what the education system looks like, or have the language of rights become too kind of co-opted to a particular kind of keeping things status quo? And I think, me personally, I would argue that rights are fundamental and that there's lots of important gains, either human rights in general or rights for children. And so it would be kind of dangerous to discard those concepts. But I do really agree with the kind of with the critiques. And then I think it's thinking about such examples like the young people in Chile. Does that open up new space for kind of adults and children to work together to reform education or healthcare or the other challenges that we face both in Chilean society but also globally as well?
I agree with that. I was thinking also about the possibility of I'm still thinking about this intergenerational thing of having the possibility to place people from different generations, from different ages, to build a bridge that allows us to talk to each other and to discuss in equal conditions. Because generally what I've seen is that under this idea of the children's rights, is like they're asked, there are spaces to talk, but there is no real recognition of the contributions that they can make. And you can see that when I was talking about all the things that the authorities said, you see that there is a full main discourse of how do we respect children's rights, how do we take care of children. The slogan of this government was children's first. But at the same time, you see how children have been arrested, have been abused in the streets during the protests. So I insist that I think it's very important to create those spaces that join, that put together all the generations to talk in equal like conditions. But that's very difficult because we have a structure that is built on power relationships of oppression, and children are under this. Maybe not the phrase, but it's under the oppression of others for saying somehow. So yes, what I expect from this, given that children have been participating and have been given spaces to talk, is that we can shorten that gap a bit. But yes, it's difficult when you have this.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about Paulo Freire. The thought of Freire came to my mind. To think about the role of teachers as oppressors and the role of the students as oppressed people. So, yeah, how to deal with that role, how to change the role of teachers. And because Javiera said, when you are trying to promote activism within a really violent institution as a school, it's really difficult to deal with that. Because when you try to promote that kind of values or that kind of rights within the classroom, you have a very big conflict among students because they have to deal with the institutions and at the same time with the situation in their houses, with the parents, with the families. So my idea is try to promote this in the first stage of teacher education, for example, in the initial teacher education, and try to promote that kind of skills or competences about how to promote the activism. Instead of try to promote the activisms during a CBD program, because when the teachers are working in the school, they have to deal with accountability. So they have to deal with a lot of different parts. So it's really difficult to add more works or activities in the school. So my idea is to promote the activism during the initial stage of teacher education.
I mean, most teacher training doesn't address the CRC or human rights at all. I mean,
It's completely apolitical.
in most countries in the world, it's not. It's simply not. In a huge number of countries, they have now sort of looked at the CRC and they've looked at Article 12 and they've introduced school councils. And if you talk to a lot of teachers in many countries around the world, so that's great, school council, really useful. Look to the children and things. I visited a whole load of young people in Bulgaria, for example, where they got a whole national, every school was required to set up a school council, so they have a national program. So I went to talk with children in quite a lot of schools, and what they said was that, yes, and they started saying, oh, it's great, So I said, well, what do you do? And they said, well, we organise the end of the term dance, and we raise money for poor children, and we take part in local community festivals. And then I started talking about how school was, and they talked about the teachers were very old, the curriculum was irrelevant, the teaching methods were very poor. It was a really boring place to be, and they wanted something different for their futures. And so I said, well, why don't you raise those issues with the school council? And they looked at me as if I sort of landed from Mars and said, because they would put down our marks, they would downgrade if we made trouble. So these school councils that the teachers have been saying so great. So it's so creating those institutions in a complete unaltered power relationship is really meaningless. So providing teachers with learning about what rights mean operationally, what it means for the kind of institution, the relation with children, the relation with the education system is really important. Empowering children to be able to understand those rights and begin to make some demands within the school. It doesn't take away the fundamentals of that power relationship, but it does. And you could argue that that's buying the children off, pacifying them so they don't make good fun. But it is also enabling them to have much more influence within a limited hierarchical framework. So, it's tiny steps up the ladder.
Maybe one question that I will title myself to make the last question because we have to. I have a very interesting question, but I was thinking this idea of what you were saying right now, that participation is not something that you can learn, but it's something that you have to do. You have to engage with participatory spaces, and participation is something that is always related to all matters of concern for children. And so the question is, like, unfortunately, we have had to be focused on more like on the basics of participation. Like children are people first. Children, they have their right to express their views. Children, they must be listened by others. But my question is, like, what are not matters of concern for children if they are engaged in our society and we recognize them as social actors? What is not related to their concern? So my question is, what would be, is it possible to think about limits of participation, of children participation? Is it possible to think, like, not to move the discussion not only on the basics that are relevant, but also what can we dream of children, about children's participation? And maybe if someone wants to add something to the question to be concluding.
Well, the Commission on Rights of the Child made it very clear that Article 12 sensitive all matters of concern, covers virtually everything. So macroeconomics, environmental issues, transport, building regulations. I mean, all of those things. They have a legitimate concern. But even beyond that, in relation to Article 13 of the right to freedom of expression, that's not bounded by anything. They can express their views on anything. They can organise about anything. So there aren't any limits, in a sense, to the legitimacy of children's activism and their right to enter those spaces. And there are clear obligations on the state to facilitate and support and legitimate that and protect children from undue harm as a consequence. So I don't think there is. I don't think it's bounded by limited aspirations. We have to. The task is how you create environments where children are able to make use of those rights and claim those rights and see adults as collaborating with them to support rather than oppressors seeking to close those spaces down. We have a long way to go. We're nowhere near in any society.
So I was thinking about something that I tried to say before, and about how children are generally taught to that they have to be like more in the private life. I was thinking about how women were taught to have to be in the private life too, and how, as we were talking about like oppressor and being oppressed, it's like I don't think there's a limit, honestly, but I think that we need to move them from that private space to the public space to try to think how they can be like in the political arena, be in political activism, and yes, of course, when you bring them to the public life, all the matters that are of public interest become their own matter. I think, I don't know, but I think there's a long way to go to get there, because we are thinking them in very constrained spaces, in the spaces within the family, and as Jason said, like the family. So how do we open up that space and bring them to the public Bueno. So, finish with the questions. I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think it comes back to the point about how participation is conceptualized as well, and the fact that with Article 12 and the right to participation, the right to expressive view was intended to be very radical, but like the examples Jerrison's given, it has become kind of co-opted and kind of restricted down to children making decisions about the dance at the end of term, for example. So I think it's both kind of conceptions of children and what suitable topics for children, but it's also about what participation looks like. And Michael Wyness has got a very interesting article where he talks about how, particularly in the global north, children's participation has become restricted to what he talks about as being voice-based forms of participation. So it's kind of like the forums, the children's parliaments, where children sit around and discuss, and then maybe adults do or don't listen. And he contrasts this with what he talks about as kind of material forms of participation, which he talks about more in relation to children in the global south, which is more the kind of the doing of participation as well. And so I'm thinking with the example with Chile, can that kind of push open some of the way that participation has been kind of reduced down? So can the actions of these young people kind of help us kind of expand or open up what we think of as children's participation, and kind of try and re-inject the kind of more radical potential, because it is radical given where the status of children were and indeed still are at, but it's kind of restricted down. So I think this is a really interesting example to try and both challenge conceptions of childhood, but also conceptions of participation.
I think it's important. I agree with that analysis, but I think that in particular in global south, that it's not just the kind of mobilization of children in kind of mass rallies and campaigning and stuff, but a huge amount of work being done by local groups of children, child clubs, in terms of fighting as human rights defenders for children's rights. So I was at a conference the other week where children were talking about, fighting against child marriage, fighting against discrimination against girls, fighting for access to justice and courts and so on. So it's fighting at that local community level as well as the much larger mass organisation.
I just wanted to add that I was thinking like what children's participation means, but also in this general framework of the Chilean crisis, I was thinking what participation means to all of us, because I think that the crisis made us realize that we weren't participating, we weren't part of anything, and one of the big demands has been to be part of something and to take part in decision making and to take part in discussions and in deliberation and etc. So I think the crisis offers there an opportunity for all of us, but it has opened a crack there also for children's participation. I think we have to take it and we have to try to enter there and say, okay, we all want to participate, but when we all participate, we have to do it because they are a part of us and the society, right? So I guess that taking away with me this idea that there is an open possibility to participate in society for all of us, and we have this opportunity now to do this, and I guess that's.
Yes, thanks to all the participants. A small sign of the time. And small person. Thanks so much for everyone that has come today, and we are thinking of doing more activities. We will keep you informed if you follow us on the social media. Thanks
Twitter, Instagram, Facebook.
So thanks so much for today, and thanks again for all the presentation.
Thank you.